My parents begged to meet my son, and I told them he doesn't exist. But the truth is, he stopped existing for them the night they threw me out. I was 16, standing in our driveway in the middle of October with a trash bag full of clothes and nowhere to go. My mother didn't even raise her voice. She just stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "You made your choice, now live with it." And my father didn't say anything at all. He just looked past me like I was already gone, like I didn't belong there anymore, like I had already been erased. I remember the porch light casting this yellow glow on the concrete, the air cold enough to sting my hands, and I kept thinking they would stop me, that one of them would step forward and say this was a mistake, that I could come back inside. But the door closed, slowly, quietly, and that sound stayed with me longer than anything they said. I didn't cry, not then. I just stood there for a minute, holding that bag, trying to understand how a life can end in less than 10 seconds, how a girl can become a stranger in her own home overnight. I walked down the street without a plan, no car, no money, just a phone with 3 contacts I wasn't sure would answer, and every step felt heavier than the last, not because of where I was going, but because of what I had just lost, not just a house, but a place where I thought I was safe, where I thought I was loved. And in that moment, I realized something that would take me years to fully understand. Love that disappears when you need it most was never really love at all. That night changed everything. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like a turning point. It felt quiet, almost ordinary, like the world didn't even notice what had just happened to me. But I noticed. I felt it settle somewhere deep inside me, something closing off, something hardening. I stopped expecting anything from anyone after that, especially from them. I learned how to survive before I ever learned how to forgive. And as I walked under those streetlights, one block at a time, I made a promise to myself that I would never stand in a doorway again, waiting for someone to decide if I belonged. I would build something of my own, something no one could take away, something that didn't depend on whether someone chose to love me or not. And years later, when they sat across from me asking about the grandson they believed existed, they had no idea that the girl they threw out at 16 was the last version of me they would ever have the chance to know. I did not go back that night. I kept walking until my feet hurt, and the streets started to blur together, the kind of quiet neighborhoods where every house looked warm from the outside, where lights glowed behind curtains, and people were inside living lives that still made sense. And I remember stopping at a bus bench even though no bus was coming, just sitting there, because it felt like the only place left that did not belong to anyone. My phone felt heavy in my hand. 3 contacts, 3 chances, and each one felt like a risk I was not ready to take, because what if they did not answer? What if they did and said no? I was not sure which would hurt more. I stared at the screen until it dimmed and went black, and for a moment I thought about turning around, about knocking on the door I had just been pushed out of, but something inside me would not let me. Not pride, not anger, just a quiet understanding that nothing behind that door was mine anymore. So I stayed where I was, breathing in the cold air, trying to slow my thoughts, trying to make sense of what came next. And that is when I realized there was no plan, no safety net, no one waiting for me to figure it out. It was just me, and that kind of silence is louder than anything. Eventually I stood up again and started walking without direction, just moving forward because standing still felt worse. I passed a gas station and caught my reflection in the glass, and for a second I did not recognize myself. I looked smaller somehow, like everything that made me who I was had been left behind on that driveway. I wrapped my arms around myself, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold on to, even if it was just me. Hours passed like that, one street into another, until the sky started to shift from black to gray, and I realized I had made it through the night without going back, without calling anyone, without breaking, and that was the first time I understood that survival does not always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like not turning around. Sometimes it looks like taking one more step when you have no idea where it leads. And as the morning light settled over everything, soft and indifferent, I made another quiet decision. I would not wait for anyone to come find me. I would not hope for an apology that might never come. I would figure it out on my own, even if I had no idea how. Because the version of me that waited for them to choose me had been left behind, and whatever came next, it would be mine, even if I had to build it from nothing by the time the sun was fully up. I had stopped thinking about where I came from and started thinking about what I needed to do next, not in big plans or dreams, just small things, simple things, like finding somewhere to sit without being asked to leave, finding something to eat, finding a place where I could breathe without feeling like I was in the way. I ended up outside a small diner on the edge of town, the kind with faded red booths and a flickering sign that buzzed quietly in the morning air. I stood there for a long moment before going in, not because I was unsure, but because stepping inside felt like stepping into a world where I had to pretend I was still normal, still someone with a place to go back to. The bell above the door rang when I pushed it open, and for a second every sound inside seemed louder than it should have been. The clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the smell of coffee and toast. It all felt distant, like I was watching it instead of being part of it. I chose a seat near the window and kept my hands folded in my lap, trying to make myself smaller, trying not to draw attention. When the waitress came over, she did not ask questions. She just smiled gently and asked what I wanted, and I realized I had not thought that far ahead. So I said coffee, even though I knew I needed more than that. She nodded like it made sense and walked away, and something about that small kindness, that lack of judgment, made it harder to keep everything steady inside me. I stared out the window while I waited, watching people pass by, each one moving with purpose, each one belonging somewhere. And I wondered if anyone could tell just by looking at me that I did not belong anywhere anymore. When the coffee came, I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the warmth settle into my fingers, grounding me in a way nothing else had that night. And for a few minutes, I allowed myself to just sit there without thinking too far ahead. But reality does not wait long. It never does. And as I took that first sip, I knew I could not stay there forever. I could not keep sitting in places that were not mine, hoping no one would notice. I needed to decide something, anything, even if it was wrong, because doing nothing was not an option anymore. And that was when I finally picked up my phone again, not because I felt ready, but because I understood that waiting to feel ready was a luxury I no longer had. I scrolled through those same 3 names, my thumb hovering over each one, weighing the cost of asking for help against the fear of hearing no. And then, without giving myself time to change my mind, I pressed call, and as the line began to ring, I realized this was the moment everything would start to change, not because someone might save me, but because I was finally choosing to stop disappearing. The ringing felt louder than it should have, each tone stretching longer than the last, and for a second I almost pulled the phone away from my ear, almost told myself it did not matter, that I could handle this alone. But then the line clicked and a familiar voice answered, soft and surprised, "Emily?" And everything inside me went still. I had not realized how much I needed someone to say my name like that, like it still belonged somewhere, like I still belonged somewhere. It was Sarah, my old neighbor from 2 streets over, someone who used to wave when I walked home from school, someone who once told me I could stop by any time. Words people say without thinking, words I never thought I would actually test. I did not explain everything, not right away. I just said I needed a place to stay for a little while, and there was a pause on the other end, not long, but long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for me to prepare for the answer I feared. But then she said yes, simple and clear, like it was not a burden, like it was not something she needed to think twice about. And that yes changed everything. I finished my coffee, left a few crumpled bills on the table, and walked the 3 blocks to her house with a strange mix of relief and disbelief settling into my chest. When she opened the door, she did not ask questions. She did not look at me like I was a problem to solve. She just stepped aside and let me in. And that quiet acceptance felt unfamiliar in a way I could not quite name. Her house smelled like laundry detergent and something warm cooking in the kitchen. And for the first time since the night before, I felt the edges of my body soften, like I did not have to hold everything so tightly together. She showed me a small room at the back of the house. Nothing special, just a bed, a dresser, a window that let in the morning light. But it felt like more than that. It felt like a place where I could exist without being pushed out. And I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding my bag, unsure of what came next, unsure of how long this would last, but certain of one thing. I had crossed a line I could not go back over. I was no longer the girl waiting for permission to stay. I was someone who had asked, who had taken the risk, who had stepped into a life that was uncertain but mine. And as Sarah moved around the house, going about her morning like everything was normal, I realized something else. Kindness does not always come from where it should. Sometimes it comes from the people you never expected, and sometimes it is enough to keep you moving forward. Even when everything else has fallen apart, I set my bag down slowly, letting it rest against the floor, and for the first time since that door closed behind me, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was not as alone as I thought. The first few days in that room passed quietly, almost too quietly, like I was afraid any sudden movement might break whatever fragile stability I had found. Sarah did not ask for explanations. She did not sit me down and demand details. She simply made space for me in small, consistent ways: a plate left out at dinner, a blanket folded at the foot of the bed, a gentle knock before entering the room. And that kind of quiet care felt unfamiliar, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was steady, and I realized how little of that I had known before. I started waking up early, before the house stirred, sitting by the window and watching the light stretch across the yard, trying to organize my thoughts into something manageable, something that did not feel like it would collapse under its own weight. But no matter how I tried to structure it, there was one reality I could not ignore. Time was moving forward whether I was ready or not. And so was everything inside me. I began to notice the changes in small ways at first: a deeper tiredness that did not go away with sleep, a heaviness that settled into my body, a constant awareness that I was not alone anymore even in the quietest moments. It was not dramatic, it was not something I could point to and say, this is the moment everything changed. It was gradual, steady, undeniable, and it forced me to confront something I had been avoiding since that night. This was not just about surviving anymore. It was about responsibility, about decisions that would shape more than just my own life. I found myself sitting at the edge of the bed one morning, hands resting against my knees, staring at the floor as if it might offer some kind of answer, but it did not. It just held me there, in that space between what had happened and what would come next. I thought about calling them, not because I wanted to go back, but because part of me wondered if they would see things differently now, if this would matter enough to change their minds. But the thought did not last long. It faded as quickly as it came, replaced by a quiet certainty that nothing I said would rewrite that night. Nothing I carried would make me belong again. And that realization did not feel sharp or painful anymore. It felt clear, almost calm, like a truth I could finally accept without fighting it. Later that afternoon, Sarah knocked gently on the door and asked if I wanted to go with her to run errands. Something simple, something normal, and I hesitated for a moment before saying yes, because stepping outside meant stepping into a world that still felt uncertain, but it also meant moving forward, and I was beginning to understand that moving forward, even in small ways, was the only thing that would keep me from standing still in a life that no longer existed. As I stood up and reached for my jacket, I realized something else had shifted inside me, something quiet but firm. I was no longer waiting for someone to fix what had been broken. I was starting to build something new. Even if I did not yet know what it would look like, the days turned into weeks, and the weeks began to shape something that almost felt like a routine, not the kind I used to know, not one built around family dinners or familiar voices, but something quieter, something built from small, deliberate choices. I started helping Sarah around the house without being asked, washing dishes, folding laundry, anything that made me feel like I was contributing instead of just existing in borrowed space. And in return, she gave me something I had not realized I needed: stability without conditions. There were no lectures, no reminders of what I owed her, just a quiet understanding that I was there, and that was enough for now. But beneath that fragile sense of normal, something else was unfolding, something I could not ignore no matter how much I tried to focus on daily tasks. My body was changing in ways that made everything feel more real, more immediate, and with that came a weight that settled deeper each day. Not panic, not fear exactly, but a constant awareness that time was moving forward, and so was this life I had to think about. I found myself counting things without meaning to: days, meals, hours of sleep, as if keeping track would somehow give me control over what was coming. But control felt like something distant, something I had not had since the night I was told to leave. One afternoon I sat at the small kitchen table while Sarah was out, a notebook open in front of me, blank pages waiting for answers I did not have. I tried to write down what I needed, what my options were, but every sentence felt incomplete. Every plan felt fragile, and I realized that no matter how carefully I thought things through, there was no version of this where everything felt certain, and that was the hardest part, not knowing, not being able to see more than a few steps ahead. Later that evening, Sarah came home with groceries and set them on the counter, moving through the kitchen with that same calm energy she always had, and after a moment she looked at me, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of awareness, like she understood more than I had said. She did not ask questions, she just said, "We will figure it out," and those 4 words settled into the space around me in a way nothing else had, not because they solved anything, but because they made it feel possible that something could be solved at all. I nodded, even though I was not sure what figuring it out actually meant, even though I did not know what choices I would have to make or what they would cost. But for the first time, since everything changed, I felt something shift again, not a resolution, not an answer, just a quiet, steady sense that I was no longer standing at the edge of something unknown without support. I was still uncertain, still carrying questions that had no clear outcome, but I was moving, slowly, carefully, and that movement, no matter how small, was beginning to shape a future that belonged to me. Even if I had not fully decided what that future would look like yet, time did not move all at once. It stretched quietly, folding days into months in a way that made it hard to notice when things had changed until they already had. I found a part-time job at a small grocery store a few blocks away, nothing complicated, just stocking shelves and ringing up customers. But it gave me something steady, something that belonged to me. I learned the rhythm of it quickly, the early shifts, the fluorescent lights, the hum of people moving in and out with their own lives that had nothing to do with mine. And in that space, I started to feel something I had not felt in a long time. Capable, not because everything was figured out, but because I was handling what was in front of me. One shift at a time, one task at a time. And that was enough, at least for now. The changes in my body became more noticeable as the weeks passed. Not something I could ignore anymore. Not something I could push to the back of my mind while I focused on work or routine. It was there in every step, every quiet moment. A constant reminder that decisions were getting closer, that whatever came next would not stay abstract forever. I found myself spending more time thinking about the future, not in big dreams, but in practical questions: where I would live, how I would manage, what kind of life I could realistically build with what I had. And each question led to another, forming a chain that never quite reached a clear answer. One evening after work, I sat alone in the small room, the light from the window fading into dusk, and I let myself consider something I had been avoiding, not out of fear, but because it felt too final to put into words. I thought about what kind of life I could offer, not just to myself, but to someone else, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that wanting something and being able to provide it were not always the same thing. The realization did not come with panic. It came with a quiet, steady weight, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there, asking to be acknowledged. I sat there for a long time, not searching for an easy answer, because I already knew there was not one, but trying to understand what mattered most, what I could live with, what I could not. And in that stillness, I felt something shift again, not a solution, but a direction, something that felt less like reacting and more like choosing. Later that night, I spoke with Sarah in the kitchen, not in detail, not explaining everything, just enough for her to understand that I was thinking about what came next. She listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without filling the silence with assumptions, and when I finished, she nodded slowly and said, "Whatever you decide, it has to be yours." And those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because they were simple, but they carried something important, a kind of permission I had not realized I needed, not from her, but from myself. And as I went to bed that night, I knew that the next step would not come from waiting or hoping. It would come from a choice, one that would define everything that followed. Even if no one else ever knew about it, the decision did not arrive all at once. It settled into place quietly, like something that had been forming long before I was ready to name it. And once it was there, I could not unsee it. I spent the next few days moving through my routine with a strange sense of clarity. Everything looked the same on the outside: the grocery store, the small room, the familiar streets. But inside, something had shifted. I was no longer waiting for the future to happen to me. I was preparing to choose it. I made an appointment at a clinic across town, Nothing dramatic, just a simple step that felt heavier than anything I had done so far. I did not tell many people, not because I was hiding, but because this was not something I needed to explain, not something that required approval. It was mine, completely. The morning of the appointment, I woke up earlier than usual, the house still quiet, the air still carrying that soft stillness before the day begins. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, hands resting in my lap, breathing slowly, not trying to change how I felt, just letting it exist. There was no panic, no overwhelming fear, just a deep, steady awareness that this was a turning point, one that would shape everything that followed. Sarah drove me there without asking questions, her presence calm and steady. Like always, we did not talk much on the way, not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments do not need words to be understood. When we arrived, the building looked ordinary, almost too ordinary for something that felt so significant. I stepped inside and checked in, my voice steady, my hands still, as if my body had already accepted what my mind was still processing. Time moved differently in that waiting room, slower, heavier, each minute stretching just enough to make me aware of it. But I did not look at the clock. I did not count the seconds. I just sat there, present, grounded in the decision I had already made. When my name was called, I stood up without hesitation, following the nurse down a quiet hallway, each step deliberate, each breath measured. There was no moment of doubt, no sudden urge to turn back, because I understood something clearly now. This was not about fear or strength. It was about responsibility, about choosing what I could carry forward and what I could not, about shaping a future that I would have to live in day after day. And as I moved through that moment, I felt something unexpected, not relief, not sadness, but a quiet sense of control, something I had not felt since before everything changed. Later, when I stepped back outside into the afternoon light, the world looked the same, cars passing, people moving, life continuing without pause. But I knew I was not the same. Something had closed, something had been decided. And even though no one else could see it, even though it would remain something I carried alone, it marked the point where I stopped reacting to what had been done to me and started defining what would come next. And as Sarah and I drove home in silence, I rested my hand against the window, watching the city pass by, knowing that from this moment on, everything I built would come from choices that were mine, even the ones no one else would ever understand. Years passed in a way that no longer felt heavy. They moved with a steady rhythm that I built piece by piece. I kept working, saved what I could, eventually moved into a small apartment of my own, nothing fancy, just one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a window that looked out over a parking lot. But it was mine, every inch of it, every quiet morning, every late night. I filled that space with routines that belonged only to me. Coffee at the same time each day, a chair by the window where I would sit and think, and slowly, without realizing it, I stopped measuring my life by what I had lost and started recognizing what I had created. I did not talk about that year, not to anyone, not even to Sarah. It became something private, something I carried without needing to explain, and over time, it felt less like a wound and more like a line that divided who I had been from who I had become. Then one afternoon, more than a decade later, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer, and when I did, I heard a voice I had not heard in years, softer now, uncertain. My mother. She said my name like she was testing it, like she was not sure it still belonged to her. And for a moment, I said nothing, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted to hear what would come next. She asked how I was, said they had been thinking about me, said time had changed things, her words careful, almost rehearsed, and then she said it. The reason for the call. She asked about my son, her voice carrying something I recognized immediately. Expectation, hope, not for me, but for what I could give them. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the same parking lot I had seen every day for years, and I realized how different everything felt now. There was no ache, no anger rising to the surface, just a quiet clarity. They had not come back for me. They had come back for something they believed existed, something they thought they could claim. And in that moment, I understood that nothing had really changed, not in the way that mattered. I let her speak, let her fill the silence with questions about a life she had never been part of. And when she finally paused, waiting for my answer, I kept my voice calm, steady, almost gentle, and I told her the truth, not the version she expected, not the story she had imagined all these years, but the one that belonged to me. I said there was no son. I said it simply, without explanation, without apology, and the silence that followed was different from the one I had known before. It was not empty. It was final. She tried to respond, confusion slipping into her voice, but I did not fill the space for her. I did not soften it or take it back, because this was not about making her understand. It was about drawing a line that had been there all along. And as I ended the call, setting the phone down on the table, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not victory, just a quiet certainty that I had kept my promise to myself. I had built a life that did not depend on them, and whatever they had come looking for, it was something they no longer had any place in.